Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than Truth. Today is Wednesday, November 19th, and our guest is Eddie Fishman. Eddie is a leading authority on economic statecraft, sanctions, and international affairs, recognized for his expertise at the crossroads of foreign policy, business, and national security. He served in senior roles at the U.S. State Department, where he advised Secretary John Kerry on Europe, Russia, and economic sanctions, playing a central part in shaping responses to major geopolitical events such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Iran nuclear negotiations. Today, Eddie is a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy and the author of Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, drawing on a multifaceted career that spans government, think tanks, and the private sector. Eddie, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Nathan and George.
Our pleasure. Eddie, we were talking a little bit before we got on about your wonderful book, Chokepoints. And, I guess, as a starter, I would ask, how do you define what sanctions are and what makes them sort of unique as an instrument of economic warfare?
Sure. So economic warfare itself is as old as history. Anyone who studied ancient history is probably familiar with the fact that the earliest known use of sanctions was actually in 432 BC. On the brink of the Peloponnesian War, Athens imposed a trade embargo on the neighboring city-state of Megara. In the 19th century, Napoleon famously imposed an embargo on Britain called the Continental System. And even right after World War I, the entire concept of the League of Nations, as conceived by Woodrow Wilson, was effectively to use the threat of devastating sanctions on other countries to deter war. So really, in any phase of history you look at, economic warfare was a thing. But what I try to describe in my book, Chokepoints, is that there's really been a revolution in terms of how economic warfare works in the last 20 years or so. And probably the best way to illustrate this is to go back to the 1990s, right on the brink of this current period that I call the age of economic warfare. The canonical case of sanctions in the 1990s was when the United Nations imposed an embargo on Saddam Hussein's Iraq. This embargo went into effect in August of 1990, just a few days after Saddam Hussein invaded and annexed Kuwait, and it stayed in place all the way up until 2003, so for 13 years. And the primary goal of that sanctions campaign was to stop Iraq from selling oil on the global marketplace. The way, though, that the UN actually went about stopping Iraq from selling oil on the global marketplace was through a multinational naval blockade. So for that entire 13-year period, navies from over 20 different countries, commanded by a U.S. admiral, patrolled the Persian Gulf 24/7, inspecting every single tanker that was coming in and out of an Iraqi port. So the reason I sort of bring that up is that even as recently as the 1990s, to impose hard-hitting economic warfare on a foreign country, you actually needed the deployment of military force. That embargo was commanded not by the Treasury Department or the State Department in the U.S., but rather by the Pentagon. Today, we obviously have a very different scenario where, the President of the United States can just sign an executive order in the Oval Office and impose dramatic economic pain on a foreign country. And so maybe the short answer to your question, George, is that sanctions today are different from how they've been in the past because we can weaponize these invisible choke points in the global economy, like the dollar-based financial system, like advanced semiconductors, to deploy really substantial economic pain on foreign countries without putting a single U.S. service member in harm's way.
So you actually consider tariffs a kind of sanction?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the way Trump has been using them, specifically in the second term, I think it's quite different from his policy in the first term. He has been using tariffs as just another form of geoeconomic weapon, right? I mean, tariffs do have multiple purposes. They're a little bit like a Swiss Army knife when it comes to economic statecraft. You could use tariffs as a form of taxation, right, to raise government revenue. And I think Trump's tariffs so far have actually proved that you can raise quite a bit of government revenue through tariffs. Most traditionally, they can be used as a form of protectionism, right, to protect domestic industries that you consider strategic from foreign competition. So setting aside Trump, I think who's probably the president most associated with tariffs, Joe Biden imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles because he was concerned that if Chinese EVs made by companies like BYD were allowed into the US market at a low tariff, they would wipe out companies like Tesla and GM who make competitive products that are just not as good and not as cheap. And so the idea was we need a domestic auto sector. Let's put tariffs on these Chinese vehicles. Trump has been using tariffs for those purposes, but I think primarily in the second term, he has been using them in the same way that other presidents have used sanctions, really to try to persuade foreign governments to do things that they otherwise wouldn't want to do. So examples here, since August, India has been under a 50% U.S. tariff, ostensibly because India is buying Russian oil. That's been sort of used as a cudgel to try to persuade the Indian government to stop buying Russian oil. The caveat I would provide, though, George, is that, when you think about tariffs as an economic weapon, what you're actually exploiting is the U.S. as a destination for other countries' exports, right? Because tariffs are ultimately import taxes. The U.S. is the world's biggest importer, so it's a valuable market for other countries to sell into. But we're only representative of 13% of global imports, which is actually quite small relative to our overall economic weight. The U.S. is 25% of global GDP. And then when you talk about real choke points like the dollar is involved in 90% of foreign exchange transactions. NVIDIA is making 85, 90% of all of the high-end AI chips in the world. They're designing them. China, which we've all viscerally got to know in recent months, refines 90% of the rare earth elements in the world. So if you compare those, what I would consider real choke points in the global economy, with the U.S. as a destination for other countries' exports, tariffs just aren't really weaponizing one of our economic strengths. And so I worry that when tariffs are used like an economic weapon, they're not going to prove as successful as financial sanctions or technology-related export controls.
I want to come back to sanctions in a moment, but real quick, for our listeners who don't remember, George had a role in the current administration's policy crafting of the policy around tariffs. George, actually a question for you. What was the goal with the tariff policy in the second Trump administration? Was it as sort of a sanction tool or revenue? Like, what were you guys thinking when you were trying to implement these?
Well, I know you've heard me say it before, Nathan, and Eddie, this really is your interview, but, when you want to conduct war, when you want to conduct war in the United States government, you go to what used to be called the Department of Defense, now called the Department of War. But when you want to conduct economic warfare, I don't know if you'll agree with this, Eddie, but I feel like you have to go to half the cabinet, right? And so for me to answer this question is to recognize that there were lots of voices who had many justifications, right? And so there's a bit of a sort of intellectual ratatouille. Everybody could sort of choose their favorite vegetable in the economic policy. But I will say that to my mind, there were several legitimate kind of interlinking purposes. One of them was to fundamentally change the trading relationship between the United States and China, because sort of hiding behind the official statistics that we hear are, tremendous vulnerabilities connected to the fact that much of the world's, goods-based economic activity originates in some way from China. But more broadly, I think there's also an angle here of revenue collection in the sense that the United States underwrites this vast international trading system, and that system cannot bankrupt the United States in order for it to kind of continue in perpetuity. So to reconfigure the system so that it in some ways supports the United States, and then finally to prevent the illicit transfer of things like fentanyl into our country. But I've always thought of fentanyl as just the most dangerous and the most important. I will never forget the day that Customs decided to push the Consumer Protection Bureau to, ban these baby trade. What are they called? Baby. Where you push your children around, like baby carriage, stroller carriage. Yeah,
you'll learn that someday.
Yeah, that was a Freudian block. I'm trying to keep that out of my head. But I mean, there were these strollers that were coming from China that looked exactly like ones you buy on Amazon, but were $300 less, and they were collapsing and they were hurting, they were maiming babies, and I just so again, there were lots of kind of fentanyl in plastic form, right? So those are the main reasons. But I would love to hear your critique, Eddie, or whether you think that I'm misconstruing. I mean, I think there are other reasons the administration. I think there are people who in the administration believe that the United States has been treated too much like a sort of market, not a country, like a sort of, Bloomberg terminal with a flag stapled on it, as I've called it before. And so their motive is to change that sense of itself. But anyway.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And look, I mean, I think one of the most interesting parts for me of writing Chokepoints was, there's a big section of the book that's all about Trump's first term, and specifically about the building of Trump's China policy, export controls on companies like Huawei, the tariffs that the U.S. Trade Representative in the first term, Bob Lighthizer, really pioneered, and something that by virtue of speaking to over 40 of the main officials in the first Trump administration, and also my own service in government, I really agree with what you said, George. Is you've got a lot of cooks in the kitchen when it comes to economic warfare. A lot of the people may have different motivations for pursuing the policies that they have. And ultimately, you wind up getting a bit of a hodgepodge. So I would agree. I think it does feel like the Trump administration has a lot of different purposes that they're attaching to the tariffs. But interestingly enough, when it comes to even issues like fentanyl, the objective feels like it's you're trying to apply pressure to governments like the Chinese government to ban the export of fentanyl precursors to countries like Mexico, right? So you're ultimately trying to exert leverage over the Chinese government, and so I do think it's another form of sanctions. At the same time, one of the few areas that the Trump administration has been quite aggressive on traditional financial sanctions is on fentanyl, because the Treasury Department has been deploying sanctions against Mexican financial institutions and other groups in Central and South America that are involved in the illicit narcotics trade. So yes, I think I would generally agree with George, and it's great to hear a perspective of someone who's actually on the inside.
I have a very reductive question, but Eddie, does sanctions work? You were talking about Saddam Hussein. Sanctions were levied against him. You helped write sanctions in 2014 against Russia, yet Russia invaded Ukraine 8 years later, and they have not behaved better since. Saddam never behaved well until he was dead. Do they work?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's interesting, Nathan, because this is a question that, even before I worked in this field, was one that I was familiar with. Like you hang out around different political science departments. It's, do sanctions work? I think there have been a number of articles even written with that title. The thing I always found a little bit peculiar about that question is, I also had the good fortune of doing a tour working at the Pentagon, where I served on the Chairman's Action Group, working for General Marty Dempsey, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. And one question I never heard come up at the Pentagon was, does a bomb work? Well, yeah, of course, bombs work quite well to blow things up, but they don't always get you what you want politically. And I think the same can be said of American sanctions. Because of America's economic power, specifically our control over key choke points like the dollar-based financial system, high-tech networks, specifically around semiconductors, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, we do have the ability to impose dramatic economic pain on virtually any other country. I mean, it's actually quite a frightening power, if you think about it, that really without any due process, congressional review, the president can effectively cut off any foreign company, individual, even entire country from using the dollar, which is effectively the circulatory system of the entire global economy. That's a real serious power. And so even a country like China, if the U.S. wanted to, we could easily send China into a recession. The question is, could you actually translate that into a political objective that we seek? I think Iran, in some ways, is a great example of how this can go wrong. The sanctions against Iran, which play a big part in my book, originally conceived during the George W. Bush administration at the beginning of his second term by an official named Stuart Levy, who really pioneers the concept of modern financial warfare. Those prove incredibly successful. So successful, in fact, that Levy, a Republican lawyer, is actually retained by the Obama administration and serves into that several years into the administration. I think there was a unity of purpose between George W. Bush and Barack Obama that, they were going to use as much economic pressure as they could to try to persuade Iran to negotiate away their nuclear program, basically peacefully resolve concerns about Iran's nuclear program. The culmination of that was the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. Of course, Trump comes in his first term, says that sanctions were working so well that if we had only sanctioned Iran more, we could have gotten an even better deal that wouldn't have just dealt with their nuclear program, but also their missile programs and their support for terrorism and their human rights abuses. And he tried to reimpose sanctions, which applied significant economic pressure on Iran again, but didn't actually get his political objectives. And I think ultimately, and tragically, that's what's led us to the current moment where we've been in a state of war effectively with Iran, right? Where we've exchanged military strikes, over the past year. So I do think that the challenge is, and particularly in our sort of divisive political climate, where you have very little unity anymore between Republicans and Democrats, is can you actually execute a strategy that goes beyond a single political cycle? And we've so far, unfortunately, failed to do that in the last couple of decades.
That's been a critique of mine for a while. Go ahead, George.
Well, I'm interested. So, in terms of like what you think is warranted versus what you think is unwarranted about the global kind of Liberation Day tariff regime. Where do you stand on that? I mean, specifically, I'd just be fascinated to kind of hear your thoughts on the kind of question of basing tariff hypothetically, because we've never heard this said by the administration publicly, but basing the magnitude of the tariff on the balance of trade deficit, right? And I ask about this in part because, if your main aim is to deal with the CCP that is willing to transship, right? What other metric is easily available to kind of sanction third party countries, even those that purport to be our friends and allies?
Yeah. So I'm pretty critical of the Liberation Day tariffs for a number of reasons. I think at the very sort of baseline, the idea that we're deploying economic warfare, not just against our adversaries, the Chinas and Russias of the world, but just as much against our friends and allies, the EU, Canada, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, India, right? A country that, is actually one of the few bright spots of bipartisan U.S. foreign policy that for multiple presidencies we've been trying basically to pull into our orbit. I'm concerned about that, frankly, because one of the sort of perennial questions about American economic warfare is, are we undermining the sort of root of American economic power? Are we giving other countries an incentive to hedge against reliance on the dollar and U.S. technology? I've been typically skeptical of that argument because if it's just China and Russia and Iran and North Korea who are hedging against the dollar, go ahead, go form your own block of autocracies that very few countries are going to want to join, right? And that's what they've been doing now for the past decade. The thing I'm worried about is now you have virtually every country in the world that, even if they've come to some sort of a truce with the current U.S. government, has this sort of shadow of a doubt in the back of their mind that the U.S. might turn weapons of economic war against them, and that's what I hear. I've been fortunate enough to be traveling around the world talking about this book. It's been translated into almost a dozen languages. And what a lot of these folks will tell you in countries that are U.S. allies is behind closed doors that they still really don't trust the United States after what's happened to them. I think when it comes to China specifically, I'm also quite critical of what happened in April, largely because of sort of what I said earlier, where if you're trying to exert leverage over the CCP, tariffs is not the way to do it. China, they only sell 14% of their exports to the United States. They're not dependent on selling their goods to the U.S. And the data actually bears that out. This year, China's exports to the U.S. have fallen by about 25%. So the tariffs have worked to make China sell less stuff to the U.S., but their overall exports have actually gone up by 10%. So what that means is they've found other markets for the goods that they used to sell to the U.S. I think if Trump actually wanted to exert leverage on China, I would have preferred to see tools like financial sanctions. China is still dependent on the use of the dollar. They only settle 30% of their own foreign trade in their own currency, right? They're still dependent on the dollar for about 70% of their international transactions. I think if Trump was trying to build leverage, targeting a handful of really egregious Chinese companies like Hikvision, which is spying on all these people around the world through surveillance technology, putting them on the sanctions list, deploying more high-tech export controls on semiconductors and other technologies that China could use to do Americans harm. That's what I would have liked to see. And I think that would have been a punch that's much more powerful than sanctions, and one, frankly, that would have exceeded the pain that U.S. companies like Ford suffered when we were cut off from rare earth minerals. They had to shut down factories. And so the tragedy, I think, George, is that by virtue of the U.S. coming out with tariffs that ultimately were not politically sustainable, we couldn't sustain those tariffs for more than a few weeks, and then China coming out with these rare earth export controls that were devastatingly effective, in the eyes of much of the world, China now has the upper hand in the economic war with the U.S., and I worry about those strategic consequences.
At the end of the Obama administration, he got the Trans-Pacific Partnership passed, and of course, President Trump quickly pulled us out of that. How would the U.S. have more choke points if we stuck in it, and would we have been stronger and have more leverage in getting our way with the Chinas of the world and Indias?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the ironies about economic warfare is that, the prerequisite to having a choke point that you can exploit is having other countries opt in to your system, right? If you didn't have the 1990s, the period of hyperglobalization where, China enters the global trading system, where they start using the dollar for their trade, where Russia does, where, other countries do, you would not be able to weaponize these levers of interdependence. And so for sure, the more the more the U.S. can build big blocks of countries that are reliant on our technology, on our finance, not only does it give us more soft power, but it actually gives us more hard power because we can actually weaponize those levers. I mean, I think with TPP, at least my vision of that wouldn't be necessarily, using interdependence to punish Japan or punish, Vietnam or other countries that were part of TPP. I think it's more about surrounding China with a big block of U.S. allies that can really confront it in a unified manner. One thing that Trump has started to do a little bit, if you look at sort of some of his recent trade deals in Southeast Asia, like with Malaysia, for instance, there are elements of those that do kind of seem like they're almost like an embryonic form of, a trade bloc against China. But, I wish that we had just embraced what we had on the table in 2016. And what I'd say about Trump is, yes, he did pull us out of it, but Obama couldn't get it through the Senate in the first place. And I think Hillary Clinton also said she wasn't going to ratify it. So I think I wouldn't just blame Trump with the failure of TPP. I feel like it's a broader story of, the American people's sort of disillusionment with this idea of free trade agreements.
I'd love to jump in here. I mean, I certainly follow what you said before. I'm fascinated, though, as a trade attorney and, as someone who thought, oh, my goodness, I'm so excited. The Council on Foreign Relations is going to be run by, someone who's a trade geek just like me. I thought that we might enter this era in which there was a great deal more sort of incredulity towards statistics like the ones that China puts forward about its exports to the United States, specifically because if you look at the mechanics of trade, so often what you see is either, blatant transshipment or many different varieties of kind of masking where things come from. And so the clearest example to my mind that has been sort of debated in public is Vietnam, where they have a massive amount of exports to the United States and not nearly the ability domestically to produce those goods. And so clearly what's taking place is a schema of sort of, screwdriver jobs locally to put together the goods so that they would be adjudged of origin Vietnam as they arrive in the United States. And yet most of the material actually comes from China. And I mention this because, to my mind, this is why we have this global schema in place, is because the overwhelming production of goods of low value in the world economy actually primarily takes place in China. And to overcome that, you need to go after even those who we would hope, are our friends and allies, because they are so deeply complicit. The so-called Tijuana two-step just stands out in my mind as an example of why Mexico needs to be tariffed so highly, not because they're acting outside of their economic interest, but because they are. So I wonder, how does that resonate with you and your perspective on it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a deeper dive into the data would be interesting. I think there's clearly a lot of diversion that's going on and transshipment where Chinese goods are, maybe going to Vietnam or other countries. Maybe they're very lightly modified, if at all, and then sort of sold to the U.S. at a lower tariff. That's certainly something that's happened with Mexico, right? Where Chinese exports to Mexico went up by quite a bit, and then we're sort of taking advantage of rules under USMCA to come into the U.S. with a low tariff. I think that to deal with the transshipment problem, and I'm interested in your perspective too, having worked at DHS, it sounds like, to me there are two really valuable ways to deal with it. One is a serious content-based tariff regime. So one where you're not just applying the tariff of the full value of the goods from the most recent point of origin. So if goods are coming in from Vietnam, you're not just tariffing at 100% whatever the Vietnam rate is, but you're actually tariffing it based on the component. So if it's coming in from Vietnam, but 90% of the value is Chinese, then 90% of the value would be, assessed at the China tariff. I know that's something that's been contemplated. It's quite hard to implement. I think it requires technology to do so. I know there are, a handful of firms that are providing this kind of technology. I think secondarily, another option, which in some ways is diplomatically more challenging, but doesn't have the same technical hurdles, is building what some people have called a tariff wall, right? Could you get allies? So to Nathan's point, if you could build sort of an alliance of countries like TPP, frankly, a big alliance of democracies and like-minded countries to impose a unified tariff, almost like a customs, a common custom system customs union that had a unified tariff on China, then you would also deal with the problem, right? Because then if Vietnam was importing a good from China, they would pay the same tariff that that good would come into the United States. So I think those are the two most viable options. What Trump has done so far instead has just been impose tariffs on everybody around the world. To me, I'm not exactly sure how that deals with the transshipment problem. But I also have not been in the room planning these policies, so I could be missing something.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's more of a cudgel than a scalpel, right? And it's sort of fascinating to me. I think that in our lifetimes, I think we were in college at the same time at Yale, where we would kind of hear Schiller talk about, the need to place enormous pressure on one country at one time to achieve an outcome. Whereas Trump has sort of diffused the pressure around the globe to try to alter supply chains. But it is just an enormously, brutal kind of blow to the psyche of those who felt in charge of the global economy. I mean, it just flies in the face of, the kind of neoclassical beliefs that I think we were raised on. So nonetheless, interesting time.
When you talk to different people around the world, do you get the sense that do they think the U.S. has a trade policy or a sanctions policy, or do they think that the U.S. is playing whack-a-mole and guessing? Because I think that, to be honest.
I think that they would agree with you, Nathan, and I would say I personally also agree with you. And I think this actually goes back to a point that George made at the very beginning of the conversation, that contra the Pentagon, where anything when it comes to military force has a unified command structure that goes up to the Secretary of Defense and ultimately to the President, who's the Commander in Chief. When it comes to economic warfare, we're totally dispersed, right? I mean, Treasury has some authorities to do sanctions and now some tariffs. State has authorities to do sanctions and some export controls. Commerce has authority on export controls and tariffs. USTR on tariffs. DHS is the one who's actually enforcing a lot of the tariffs and customs and border protection policies. So, I mean, these are dispersed authorities across, probably at least half a dozen, if not more, agencies with no one in charge. This is a problem that I think other governments also have. The difference is that other governments have started solving it. So in the US, the last time we did a big shakeup of how we do these things was post 9/11, where you had the creation of DHS. Treasury, I think sort of you can even see it in the nomenclature. The top sanctions official at Treasury is called the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. It's because, all these agencies were sort of built at a time when the primary mission was counterterrorism. If you look at Japan, which I think is a little bit ahead of where we are on this, they actually recently created a cabinet minister for economic security. So they have it's equivalent if we had said, we just are going to have a secretary for economic security who controls all of these policies, tariffs, sanctions, export controls, probably industrial policy as well. The EU has moved in that direction too. They've got a commissioner for economic security. And China, of course, has MOFCOM that does a lot of this stuff. So I think that that's sort of an urgent problem that the U.S. has. As you guys probably know, given that you've read Chokepoints, primarily it's a narrative history, right? My goal with the book was to really explain how we got from the period of my childhood, the 1990s, when economic relations between countries were seen as win-win, to this current age of economic warfare, told through the eyes of the people who actually built this new era. But at the same time, given my former work as a policymaker, I couldn't help myself but provide a few policy recommendations toward the end of the book. And one of them is that we need an economic war council or something like that. I think at the very least, you would need an interagency coordinating body that actually controls all of these levers. I think at best, you would have a full department of government that streamlines these different authorities into a single official who can actually command the same way that the Secretary of Defense does.
Yeah. Fascinating.
I'm curious, the U.S. has this phenomenon where they think they're the only person in the room and the only superpower in the world. Have we seen China, India, Russia basically start hitting back yet? Sanctioning our folks, using tariffs? What will it look like moving forward?
Yeah, we are in very much an economic arms race right now. The U.S. pioneered a lot of these weapons, be it financial sanctions. The sort of resurrection of tariffs is something I largely credit to Bob Lighthizer in the first Trump administration. High-tech export controls, another one that sort of originates at the Commerce Department in the first Trump administration under Wilbur Ross's leadership, in the sort of war against Huawei that then was expanded by the Biden administration. But look, other countries watch this and they do two things. One is they realize they're vulnerable and start trying to patch up their defenses. That's where you get, countries like China launching a central bank digital currency and taking measures to try to insulate themselves from the dollar. But then you also have this economic arms race where countries say, well, the US uses these tools, can I as well? And China, they, after 2018, passed a raft of laws to basically give them the authority to do everything from targeted sanctions to export controls. They actually created something called an unreliable entity list, which I actually found humorous because in the US, we have the entity list. So they just copied and pasted it and put the word unreliable in front of it. And this is what they've done, right? I mean, as Trump imposed those tariffs that I'm quite critical of in April, China didn't retaliate just with tariffs of its own. It did export controls, most notably on rare earths, which again shut down factories by companies like Ford in the United States. It imposed targeted sanctions. It actually sanctioned the leading drone company in the United States, a company called Skydio, that forced that company to ration batteries such that its customers for a number of months could only get one battery per drone. Now you think about it, if you're a Ukrainian military officer trying to use one of these drones in a combat situation, and you only have one battery for the drone, that's a bit of a precarious situation, right? And so the Chinese have, sort of pioneered or sort of rather emulated the tools that the U.S. has pioneered. And that adds a whole nother dimension. I think what it's done is it's put a premium in the United States of also patching up our vulnerabilities. And that's why I think it's very urgent right now that the Trump administration really take the same gusto that they applied to Operation Warp Speed, where they sort of developed these COVID vaccines in record time in 2020, to do the same when it comes to critical minerals, and other dependencies that we have on China, to sort of break those choke points and protect the American people from Chinese economic warfare.
Looking forward, what choke points do you expect the U.S. to hit globally that we haven't already hit?
It's a great question. I think this is something that can either keep you up at night or maybe give you some hope, depending on which part of the side of the equation you are on. In the U.S., the primary choke point we've relied on, as I've mentioned, has been the dollar. We've also relied on semiconductor supply chains, particularly the design by companies like NVIDIA. But there are other choke points that the U.S. has that we have not weaponized for one reason or another. I think probably the most prominent of those, and the one that's likeliest, in my view, to sort of come into the purview of economic warfare in the coming years, is cloud service providers. So the whole internet is run through these giant data centers, which we also call the cloud. There's really three U.S. companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, that control over 70% of the global market for the cloud. So the global internet is basically running on U.S. companies. That is a choke point that the U.S. could weaponize. When it comes to China, I think rare earths is only the most prominent of a number of choke points in the energy sector, particularly the clean energy sector, whether it's batteries or electric vehicles themselves, solar panels, that China can weaponize. And while the current Trump administration has been somewhat hostile to clean energies and has sort of been wanting to double down on fossil fuels, which I think is potentially a viable strategy for the U.S., given that we are quite rich when it comes to oil and natural gas, the rest of the world very much is transitioning to a clean energy economy. Europe, Japan, all of our allies are doing everything they can to electrify as quickly as possible. The thing I fear, as someone who's focused on geopolitics, is if the whole rest of the world moves to a clean energy economy and China dominates all the choke points across the clean energy economy, we could enter a world where they become sort of the Saudi Arabia of this new energy system. And I worry about that because all of a sudden, it's going to be way harder to get the Europeans and other countries on side to U.S. policies if their entire energy system is run through Beijing.
So to conclude, would you recommend that the U.S. works on expanding its alliances as opposed to closing them off, and maybe spend more time trying to not punish China, but ignore Saudi Arabia and pivot towards these countries that are focused on the future?
Yeah, look, I think
maybe all day in the Oval Office with MBS, who killed Jamal Khashoggi, is not a great use of time. I don't know, but
yeah, look, I think the U.S., when it comes to energy policy in particular, I've always been a supporter of all of the above, right? We're going to keep using, the world's going to keep using fossil fuels for quite some time, and we don't want a situation to come about where maybe the world uses less fossil fuels, but every single barrel of oil is coming from Saudi Arabia and Russia, right? That's not a world I want to live in. So I'm glad that, there are drillers in my home state of Pennsylvania and places like Texas and Louisiana where they are, producing record levels of shale oil and gas. But at the same time, I don't think we can turn a blind eye to the fact that we are in the middle of an energy transition. And if we take our hands off the wheel, China is just going to completely lap us. And so that's what I would say. And then when it comes to alliances, look, this has always been the biggest strength that the U.S. has. The fact that many, many countries around the world trust us. And they view us as their friends. That doesn't mean you can't sometimes be tough with friends and allies. I think Trump, when it comes to trying to persuade NATO to increase their military spending, I'm all in favor of that. When it comes to, though, bludgeoning our allies with tariffs and sanctions, that to me, I don't really see an ROI on those types of behaviors.
Eddie, this has been wonderful. Where can our... Oh, go ahead, George. I'm sorry.
No. We'll have to follow up on those points. I'd love to continue the conversation.
But I do want to respect your time.
But this has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
And where can our listeners follow your work?
Sure. Thanks for asking. So I teach at Columbia. So if there's anyone who attends Columbia, hangs out by Columbia, drop me a line. I'd love it if you do read Chokepoints. One of the great joys of writing a book is that after it's out there, some people do read it. And so if you have read the book, you love it. If you hate it, send me an email. Always appreciate hearing from readers. And then finally, you're welcome to follow me on X. I post every once in a while at Edward Fishman. But otherwise, hope to see you around. I've been touring around with my book, so come to a book talk.
Thanks again for tuning in to this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time.